All right. So, a lot of shit's been going on, personal shit that I've had to deal with, but in the free time that I've had, I have been doing some more interesting studies on what is happening societally with the Black Lives Matter movement, Antifa, the Democrats, the Republicans, everything that's going on. Now, let me give you a little side story before we go into this because I want to go over what I think has the potential to happen if things keep moving the way we are. Well, we'll see history repeat ourselves. Matter of fact, let's just jump into it. Let's listen to this.
One of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states. And
Discourse. So the discussions that happen before a nation decides to commit genocide, which I feel is happening right now.
the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group
Black
that's going
people,
to commit the genocide.
trans
First of all,
people.
their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So
Okay, so the victims are the blacks, the gays, the transgenders, anyone else who is part of that little alphabet group and who are going around running talking about how they're being victims. The demagogues who are promoting it are the Democrats and the media.
they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. It's something like that. And so there's something very pathological about the enhancement of victimization, which is, well, see, the problem as far as I'm concerned with it is it's not thought through very well. Because there's a point that's being made, and the point is that people have been oppressed and they suffer. And that's true, that point. But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like access to certain forms of redress, let's say.
Okay, so that was a lot to take in. So let's talk about what he just said. So, because a certain group of people feel that they have been oppressed, that they sit there and they take it personally and they don't realize that other people have been oppressed and that everybody is a victim. That you cannot sit there and say that you are a victim and only a victim and that everyone else is a perpetrator who is against you and that you have never been a perpetrator of any type of oppression, right? And that because you place yourself in this victim box and you don't look at any of the bad things that you've ever done in your life. You then take on this almost righteous sense where I am then allowed to do whatever I want to justify what has happened to me. So let's think about this. You have been told by the mainstream media that black people have been oppressed since before this country was even founded, and it's this country's fault. So, like, let's say the 1619 Project about how horrible slavery is. I don't think anyone's going to argue that slavery was horrible, right? Owning another person just doesn't seem right. But we're past that. But the mainstream media doesn't want that narrative to persist. So they sit there and say, well, systemically, all of our institutions are still racist. And you have been oppressed, so, and you're not any type of perpetrator. So you're allowed to go out and loot and riot and kill people and burn shit down as a form of redress for the crimes that have been committed against you. You've been oppressed, so you're allowed to go out and do whatever you want. That's some bullshit.
It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the things that characterized the Soviet Union, and this was particularly true in the 1920s, but afterwards, is so the Soviets were very much enamored of the idea of class guilt. So, for example, although it was only about 40 years previously that the serfs had been emancipated, they weren't much more than slaves, right? And so that was the bulk of the Russian population. They were bought and sold along with the land. So they had been emancipated, and some of them, many of them had turned into independent farmers, and some of them had become reasonably prosperous because, at least in principle, I presume a certain proportion of them from being crooked, but I presume a larger proportion from actually being able to raise food. And of course, at that time, the bulk of the Russian food population was produced by these relatively successful peasant farmers. And relatively successful would mean maybe they had a brick house or something, and maybe they had a couple of cows, and maybe they were able to hire a few people. And so, you know, it wasn't like they were massive landowners or anything. But I've talked to you a little bit about the Pareto principle and the notion that in any domain of activity, a small proportion of people end up producing most of what's in that domain of activity. The same was true in Russia with regards to these peasant farmers. Some of them were extraordinarily efficient, and they produced most of Russia's food. When the communists came in, they described those landholders as parasites, essentially, predicated on the Marxist idea that if someone had extracted profit from an enterprise, that they had basically stolen that profit from the people, say, that they had employed or otherwise oppressed. And so you could be a member of the kulak, K-U-L-A-K, K-U-L-A-K. You could be a member of the kulak class. And then because you were a member of that class, you were automatically guilty. And so what happened was, and you got to think this through to really understand what happened. So what happened was the intellectual communists were sent out in cadres out into these little towns to find people who would help them round up the kulaks. Now you got to think about what a small town is like, because so imagine you're in a town and there's 3 or 4 people or maybe 10 people or something like that who are a little more successful than everyone else. And a certain number of people are going to be fine with that and maybe even happy about it because they regard those people as particularly productive and, you know, as stalwart members of the community, regardless of their flaws. But there's going to be some people who are not happy about it at all, that are going to be very resentful about that and jealous. And so those are going to be people whose characters, I would say, are of the less positive type. And so when the intellectuals came in and described the reason that these people should be treated as parasites and profiteers, then it was the resentful minority in those towns, and that would be the kind of guy that hangs around in the bar all the time and is completely unconscientious and fails at everything and then blames everyone else for it. The intellectuals came in and said, this is unfair that this happened to you. You've actually been victimized, and now it's your opportunity to go have your revenge. And so that's exactly what happened. Now,
all right, so let's think about this. At a point in time, people were slaves, right? They were freed, and the majority of those people who were slaves, they were serfs. So when someone sold the land, those people were the workers of the land, and when you bought the property, you bought the people that came along with the property. 40 years previously, those people were freed. A majority of them went to go on and continue to grow food because that's what they knew, and a portion of them became successful, okay? At some point in time, communists came along who had some intelligence, and they went to the lowest rung of society and they said, these people have oppressed you. And how did they oppress you? Because they have gained wealth not off of being good workers, good farmers, or anything like that, because basically they have stolen from you. It doesn't matter that they paid you wages and that you didn't have to work that farm if you didn't want to. Let's not worry about the the fucking nuance of what this argument is. So now is your opportunity to go and get back at them, right? What does this sound like? And they're like, oh, to them successful was having a brick house, maybe a cow or two, and you could house. That sounds like a small business owner, someone who owns 1, maybe 2 cars, right? Has the ability to own a home and pay their mortgage, right? And maybe is able to hire someone, help them run the business that they have. And then some low-life piece of shit, fuck-ass motherfucker is going to come along and say that somehow I've been oppressed and that I'm entitled to all the things that you have, right? And that I'm going to come and take it. What happens when that happens?
In some of the villages, sometimes the peasants would actually surround the farmsteads of these more successful people and try to defend them, but those
are the David Dorns of life.
And so then these mobs, these angry mobs, would go into the farmhouses and strip the place right down.
Oh, that sounds like the looting and rioting.
Sent them on trains with no food out to Siberia, where there was no place to live. And so that they were packed into houses, maybe they had a square meter each to live in, and all their children died of typhoid, and many of them froze to death. Many, many people died. Millions of people died as a consequence of the dekulakization.
And then what happened?
As a consequence of its total effect. So what happened then was that
you get rid of all the farmers who actually know how to farm and are productive.
There wasn't any food produced.
Oh!
And so then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death in the 1920s, which is something you never hear about, right? You never hear about that. Why do you never hear about that? That's a question worth asking. No, it was an absolute catastrophe. They used to, so these people were starving, right to the point of cannibalism, right? I mean, it was ugly as anything you could possibly imagine. If you were a mother, and so you're supposed to hand all your grain into the Central Committee, mostly for distribution into the cities. You didn't get to keep any for yourself. And so maybe then afterwards, if you were a mother, you'd go out in the fields that had already been harvested, and you'd pick up individual grains of wheat. And if you didn't turn those in, that was death for you. So that's how far it was pushed. So that's a little story about how victimization, how the idea of victimization and perpetration can get out of hand extraordinarily rapidly. And
so have we come that far? No, not yet. But guess what? Are we moving that way? It seems like I can see a lot of history repeating itself right now. And guess what? You're not going to send me off to some other fucking country, and I will not starve to death. You are going to have to fucking kill me first, and I guarantee you that if you try this shit here in America, and you keep on with this bullshit rhetoric, I will take out so many of you before I go. We'll see you in the next one.